thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're delighted to welcome back to our program Alex Traiman, who is the Managing Director and Jerusalem Bureau Chief of JNS.org. Alex has been a regular on our program, and he has a tremendous, sagacious, and astute handle of what is going on within the Israeli electoral system. And to make things even more complicated, of course, all of us throughout the world have been dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And during all of this electoral haggling, Prime Minister Netanyahu has also had to deal with this crisis. So here to talk about both issues is the incredibly talented Alex Traiman. Alex, please tell us, how has Israel managed to deal with the coronavirus outbreak first?
Thank you. The results show so far that decisions have been taken rather admirably, and where you can really see that is in the relatively few number of cases compared to many other Western nations in Europe and certainly in the United States. And even most importantly, the fatality rates in Israel are extraordinarily low. From what I have been following since the corona outbreak began in Israel, we've lost approximately 175 people, the majority of which were elderly with significant pre-existing conditions. Of course, there have been some exceptions to that rule, but it's really been, these are the minority cases. And if you just consider that to fatalities in the state of New Jersey yesterday, you will find that basically the number of people that have succumbed to coronavirus in a single day in many US states now is less than have succumbed to coronavirus since the outbreak of the pandemic in Israel, several weeks ago. So in Israel, of course, we are also used to some degree of divine providence, you could say. We've seen that, with thousands upon thousands of rockets fired into Israel over the years, and very few fatalities as a result of those rockets. We saw it also in the Gulf War when 39 Scud missiles landed in Israeli territory and only a single person died of a heart attack. So perhaps we're getting some kind of the same divine protection, but there's also been very, very good decisions, among those to immediately shut the borders and to restrict flights. There's really just a handful of flights from key destinations that are coming into Israel right now. And since almost the beginning, partial lockdowns of the society, we're still in a very much in a lockdown situation. Over the entire week of Passover, there was almost a full lockdown where people were basically banned from going more than 100 meters from their house. Everyone was told to hold a Passover Seder in their own home and not together with families, so that children and grandchildren would not infect grandparents who are much more likely to develop complications if they would contract coronavirus, and certainly to acquire the necessary safety and medicinal equipment that's necessary to fight coronavirus, such as the importing of ventilators, masks, hazmat suits, chloroquine pills, which potentially could be used to treat some of the symptoms of coronavirus and keep it from becoming a more serious case. So really lots of steps have been taken in order to gird the country as quickly as possible against coronavirus. And those efforts have already proven themselves, and the nation understands that. So the importance of that is that people that were very opposed to Netanyahu continuing in the seat of prime minister prior to the outbreak of coronavirus are now somewhat relieved that there is a long-standing, competent, and successful prime minister managing the crisis, as opposed to a rookie lawmaker in Benny Gantz, who's never been a parliamentarian and doesn't have the same type of diplomatic relationships that Netanyahu has leading the charge. So that's very important. Israelis appreciate that. And what that means is that Gantz's move to form a unity government with Netanyahu was all the more prescient. It was the appropriate thing to do. Now, a few details of the arrangement. This is a unity rotation arrangement, which is a very uncommon form of government that's been formed in Israel. There is precedent for it. Yitzhak Shamir and Yitzhak Rabin had Shimon Peres rather. Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres had a rotation arrangement in the 80s. So there is some kind of precedent to it, but it's very unique in Israeli history. Netanyahu will serve as the prime minister for the first 18 months of the government term, which is a 3-year term. And after 18 months, which is in September of 2021, next year, Benny Gantz will take over as the prime minister. Meanwhile, Benny Gantz opens as the defense minister of the state of Israel and also the vice prime minister of the state of Israel. Once the rotation occurs, Benjamin Netanyahu will become the vice prime minister of the state of Israel. So this is the formation, the basis of the formation of the government. There is basically an equal representation of ministers between the very large Likud and right-wing camp and the much smaller remaining half of the blue and white and their supporters that have come into the government between ministries. So even though Gantz and his allies have a much smaller percentage of the total number of Knesset members in the coalition, they will receive an equal number of ministries to the right-wing bloc. And in addition, they will hold some key ministries like the defense ministry, the foreign ministry, which will be held by Gabi Ashkenazi for the first 18 months of the government. Ashkenazi, who is Gantz's number 2, will be the foreign minister. At which time, once Gantz becomes the prime minister, Ashkenazi, who also was a former chief of staff of the IDF, will slide in and become the defense minister, and the foreign ministry will revert to the Likud. So you see that it's a complicated formation. Some other key ministries, including the justice ministry, will be in the hands of blue and white, which is very important because it was believed that Netanyahu would try to pass some legislation that would enable him to remain in office despite and even to have potential immunity from the indictments that he's currently facing. And in fact, his trial in 3 separate corruption cases, which was scheduled to begin in March, has been postponed until the end of May. And it could be that that trial will be postponed further. And we don't know. It was postponed based on the restrictions that were created by the coronavirus in both the private and the public sectors. At the time when Netanyahu made the move to postpone the trial, of course, the opposition railed that Netanyahu was exploiting the crisis for the purposes of protecting himself. Of course, within a number of days, it was clearly obvious that the entire country was going to get shut down, including judicial hearings and the like. But it's expected that the trial will begin either in May, if not May, maybe in June, maybe in July, maybe in August. We don't know exactly when it will take place. But within the first 18 months in which Netanyahu is the prime minister, his trial will begin. And so this actually makes the unity alignment with Gantz all the more important for Netanyahu, because Gantz was holding a very large minority, almost an even portion of Knesset members opposing Netanyahu. And also Gantz was threatening Netanyahu in the days and hours leading up to the signature of the unity agreement that he was getting set to advance 4 separate pieces of legislation that would have barred Netanyahu from serving as prime minister, some on the basis of retroactive term limits, which would have been established to get Netanyahu out of office based on time that he's already served in that position, and other pieces of legislation preventing a minister under indictment, Knesset member under indictment, from forming a government. So by having Netanyahu join forces with Gantz, all that legislation is tabled, and creates tremendous amount of stability for the government, even in the face of the trial, which we can be certain is going to be an absolute media circus when it starts, because the media has no love whatsoever for Benjamin Netanyahu, and they will make this the story of the century. Think about what the impeachment was in Congress for president against President Trump. It's going to be like this, maybe magnified when the trial begins. So the ability of Netanyahu to somehow crack the opposition into half and to bring the chief opponent of Netanyahu into his own government for 18 months, where he will be held at bay because he has the promise of becoming the prime minister after those 18 months, is very important for the stability of governance in Israel. And that's basically the situation where we're at right now. Okay, you guys have
Great.
There's a lot of other details, of course.
A lot of other details. Okay, so I have a bunch of questions as you're talking. I was thinking, where does this place the plans, the Trump peace initiative, which included the annexation of the settlement blocks in Judea and Samaria?
Oh, excellent question.
Would that be within the first 18 months?
This was one of the sticking points in the negotiations, and Gantz had opposed any formal application of sovereignty over the disputed territories in Judea and Samaria, including all of the Jewish settlements and outposts. He had opposed that, especially without the approval of Jordan and Egypt, and Netanyahu has convinced him to drop that opposition. It's one of the articles of the agreement. It's Articles 28 and 29 deal specifically with the application of sovereignty. And the issue of application of sovereignty, according to the agreement bylaws, is able to come before the government in July, which corresponds with the time that the United States has said that the complex mapping process of exactly which pieces of land would be expected to remain part of Israel under any possible peace negotiations in the future. That once that complex mapping process is complete in July, that Netanyahu and the Likud party will be able to bring the issue for a vote, and it's part of the coalition agreement that this will pass with a majority. So the issue of application of sovereignty is expected to go forward with the approval both of Netanyahu and Gantz, and that is one of the key agreements that was made between the two parties.
Excellent. And another question that I have is, how does this relate to all of the charges? If these charges are dropped in the Knesset, does that mean that the judicial branch will not come forth and still want to apply its pressure against Netanyahu?
Okay, so there's a few separate issues that all conflate here at the same time. The first is that the Attorney General has opened 3 separate corruption cases against Netanyahu, and the trial is going to begin in the coming months, as discussed earlier. Gantz had been willing to advance 4 separate pieces of legislation to oust Netanyahu. The unity agreement essentially cancels the ability of any of those pieces of legislation to pass. Those pieces of legislation are now off the table. And by the way, the Likud will control the Knesset speaker, which is the individual who's responsible for bringing proposed legislation for a vote before the plenum. So there will be no legislation against Netanyahu brought forward during this process. However, there is one wild card in the situation, which is the Supreme Court of Israel. And the last time we had a call, I remember the Supreme Court had just significantly intervened in the procedures of the legislative branch by forcing Yuli Edelstein, the former speaker, to hold a vote on his own replacement, which was in complete contradiction of the Knesset bylaws. So they intervened in the legislature, and it was basically part of an attempted judicial coup that was cooked up together with member of the opposition, Yair Lapid, to try to wrestle control of the parliament in absence of a parliamentary majority, a formal coalition, to advance this legislation. And the court happily played along. Fortunately, Edelstein resigned. He did not hold the vote, and Gantz cracked at that moment and decided that he would engage in negotiations and split up his alliance with Lapid. However, the court now still will hear petitions, and already I believe petitions have been filed that would still call to prevent a prime minister under indictment from forming a government. Now, Israeli law is explicit in stating that a prime minister, and only a prime minister, not any other minister, but a prime minister under indictment can continue to serve as the prime minister, not only during a trial, but even through a conviction and until all formal appeals processes are expired, which could be a process of several years. But even though the law is explicit, the law is not been tested in any previous administration, and the Supreme Court, which is known to be a very liberal court and an activist court, very well may say that the law is illegal, because the Supreme Court in Israel cancels laws and tells the Knesset to draft new laws to replace other laws that it cancels. So there is no telling whether or not the Supreme Court would, in fact, invalidate Netanyahu. However, that said, within the coalition agreement, there are numerous, and this is one of the reasons why the negotiations took so many weeks, numerous clauses to prevent either Netanyahu or Gantz or the court from breaking up this unity alliance. So according to the agreement, if the Supreme Court would take some ruling that would invalidate Netanyahu, Gantz would not become the prime minister. Rather, that would immediately trigger a fourth election. And the Israeli electorate has now just gone through 3 consecutive elections. And this unity arrangement was signed almost at the last minute before a fourth election was called. The fourth election was already tentatively scheduled to take place on August 4th. So we were literally at the deadline before running to a fourth election. The 2 main challengers united in the time of a national emergency.
Mm-hmm.
The current prime minister has been leading admirably during the coronavirus crisis. And should the court intervene at this stage, I think that you could see a tremendous backlash against the court, in light of the fact that this would not be the first interference in the Israeli electoral process in the span of just over a month, but the second major interference. People forget, because of Corona and because we've had a contentious election cycle, that the court intervened grossly in the affairs of the Knesset as well as in the electoral process, because the coalition negotiations are a part of the electoral process. And the court tried to interfere in that process and did actually interfere in that process. So if they would do it,
Whoops, you froze.
sides could point to the court as being the cause of this fourth election, which everybody wants to avoid. So there's a little bit of leverage against the court in that situation too.
Right.
Another one of the sticking points in the negotiations is about the judicial appointments process. Over the next 3 to 4 years, I believe even 4 of the current Supreme Court justices will reach the mandatory retirement age of 67. So new judges will need to be appointed that will determine the overall ideological outlook of the court in the next long period. So the 2 sides, both Likud and Blue and White, have been wrestling over who controls that judicial appointments committee. The Justice Ministry will be handed over to Avi Nissenkorn, who is a Blue and White Knesset member and a Gantz ally. However, within the Judicial Appointments Committee, there is a right-wing majority, which is also facilitated by Tzvi Hauser, who was a former advisor to Netanyahu, but was aligned with Gantz because he wants to see Netanyahu ultimately replaced. But his outlook is a right-wing outlook, and his outlook on judicial issues is actually very similar to Netanyahu's. So even though he's not a fan of Netanyahu, he's actually one of the people that's probably one of the heroes of this process that forced the unity alignment between Gantz and Netanyahu, because he opposed some of Gantz's moves, like forming a government together with the Arabs, or forming a minority government with Arab support. And he also opposes the legislation, the personal legislation to remove Netanyahu from office. So even though he would like the electorate to replace Netanyahu, he's not about to make left-wing justices appointed to the court. So in that way, there's again another like leverage mechanism to sort of solve some of the issues with the Supreme Court, and make sure that better make sure at least that centrist judges are appointed to the court.
Amazing. I was under the impression that the court itself recommends judges. Is that not true? And that they're usually people that have their own ideological persuasion?
Yeah, it's correct. So basically there are 9 votes that go towards picking new judges. And the way that works is that 3 of the votes belong to the court itself. So you have a Supreme Court that has weight in selecting its own replacements, which you certainly don't have in the United States.
Right.
Then the Bar Association gets 3 votes, and the Bar Association and the court are typically aligned. So that becomes a single block where you have 6 votes out of 9. And then the Justice Ministry also gets 3 votes. So in this case, most likely the Justice Ministry will select at least a centrist candidate. And what happened in the previous coalition, which was already almost ancient history because we're already more than a year and a half ago, Ayelet Shaked from the Yamina party was the justice minister, and she actually broke up the alliance between the court and the Bar Association, and was able to push through for 4 different justices, more moderate candidates than the court would have picked itself. So that was a bit of a judicial revolution, and there's a hope that in the coming period that this pattern will continue, despite the fact that the Justice Ministry is held by a blue and white.
Right. So we have our very, very capable Sarah Leah Thompson, who has been fielding questions that have been coming in. Sarah Leah, do you want to read some of the questions?
Sure, thank you. So our first question, according to Caroline Glick, the Israeli judiciary has no constitutional check on its power, and as a result of its left lean, Israel has been driven to the brink of becoming something outside of a democracy. In view of the way this power has been used to undermine the right, what is the implication of the justice portfolio having been awarded to blue and white?
Right, I think we addressed it a little bit. I mean, Netanyahu is in a bit of a bind because of the corruption cases leveled against him. I mean, these are, for the most part, highly controversial charges, many of which have zero precedent in Israeli law and even in international law, regarding receiving bribes in the form of media coverage. There's really no legal precedent for that anywhere in a democracy with a free press. So we don't know how those charges are going to play out in court, and we can hope that that they will be thrown out potentially. Although we do have a very liberal court that does not like Netanyahu. And it's also an activist court that's willing to take stances that are not based on precedent. So we have to watch out. But because of the legal situation, Netanyahu was not in position to demand the Justice Ministry. Now, as you have gathered by the fact that we've just gone through 3 elections in a row and the court has intervened in the legislative affairs and the election, there are many, many elements of Israel's democracy and electoral system that are in dire need of repair. And Israel does not have a constitution. So when the Supreme Court makes rulings, it's not basing its rulings off of a constitution or what the founders meant by a constitution. There are some basic laws, but it's not a formal constitution. We don't have a constitution. It's very easy in the parliamentary system to collapse a government. There's no direct election for a prime minister. There's no direct election for Knesset members. So there are many elements of the Israeli democratic system that are in dire need of an overhaul. However, it will take a firm leader to stabilize the current system to be able to implement any changes. And there's virtually no way that this current alignment, which is a series of compromises built on top of compromises among internal and external challenges, that they're going to be able to resolve any of these critical issues, which does not necessarily bode well for Israel in the short term, but we can certainly hope that at some point in the future, things stabilize further and critical changes can be made.
Right. Sarah?
Thank you. The next question we have, can the judiciary halt or reverse the annexation?
That's another good question. And again, there's very little way to predict what the judiciary may or may not be able to do. There's certain basic laws which should enable the government to take this type of an action. And of course, you do have literally 400,000 Israeli citizens sitting on land that has been administered by the state of Israel since the 1967 war, and have been built up, since the Gush Emunah movement that began in the mid-70s to place them there. So we can certainly hope that the court will not interfere in the unity government's, advancing its own executive authority. And also, this may be the issue of the application of sovereignty may in fact come for a vote in the Knesset as well. It doesn't necessarily have to, according to the coalition agreement, but it could be brought to the Knesset, where it is expected to have a majority with this unity alignment. So if the executive branch and the legislative branch both vote in favor, that would probably be another lever against the court trying to overturn it. But you could be certain that left-wing NGOs that are frequently petition the Supreme Court will, in fact, petition the Supreme Court regarding the annexation. But hopefully, they will not hear the case.
Sarah?
Thank you. The next question is a little bit long, so bear with me. One of our viewers read that Netanyahu granted the Haredi parties, Shas and UTJ, the same ministries they hold in the current government, but has not yet offered any ministries to Yamina, led by Naftali Bennett. Do you think that they will be offered lower-level ministry positions, not approaching the defense, education, and transportation ministries they have in the interim government? And if so, will they join the opposition?
Right. You asked a good question, and I should have addressed this a little bit earlier, which is that the right-wing national Yamina party, which is led by Naftali Bennett and Ayel Shaked, thus far has not agreed to join the government, despite being part of Netanyahu's united right-wing bloc over the course of 3 consecutive elections. Now, with regard to what they've been offered, and also to what has been offered to the other parties, the Shas ministry the Shas party will control the interior ministry. Aryeh Deri will remain in that post, and Yaakov Litzman of the United Torah Judaism Party will remain the health minister of Israel. Each of those are lesser ministries. The interior ministry is probably a mid-level ministry. The health ministry is considered, for whatever reason, not today in a coronavirus crisis, but otherwise a lower level ministry. So each of those parties, which are both larger than Yamina, are receiving a single ministerial portfolio. In the current alignment, the education ministry, which has often been held by the religious right, the nationalist camp rather, is being held for Yamina should they decide to enter the government at a later date. I assume also that they demanded the housing ministry, which may have been a very, very interesting move for them with the impending annexation, would be available to them as well. There is no way that a party with only 6 members was going to be hold the defense ministry, especially because Blue and White had so many demands in order to come in, and Netanyahu, by and large, acceded to those demands and permitted Blue and White to gain the ministries. It should be noted that this is going to be one of the largest cabinets in Israeli history. It's going to begin with 32 ministers and will expand after 6 months to 36 ministers, which is definitely an excessive amount, and especially considering the costs of a ministry, the salary given to each minister, the car, the driver, the office, the secretary, and all the staff of a ministry. It's very, very expensive. So to have such a large cabinet is bloated, especially in a time when Israel's basically like the rest of the world in an economic crisis. However, it should be understood that the cost of a 4th election is much greater than the cost of several extra ministries. I do believe that if Yamina wants to enter the government, that they can have at least the education ministry, possibly a 2nd ministry as well, junior ministry, certainly several deputy ministries, and also would be able to chair key Knesset committees. However, I get the strong sense that that Yamina prefers at this stage not to join the government and is likely headed to the opposition.
Certainly.
Thank you. So our next question, do you think this unity government will actually serve its 3-year term, or do you think it will fall apart beforehand?
So there's that question before coronavirus, and there's that question, in the early phases of coronavirus, which we are now. Right now, Israelis aren't allowed to go more than 500 meters from their house, okay? We don't know what the situation is going to look like in the country in 1 month, in 6 months, in 18 months when the rotation agreement is supposed to take place, or in 3 years. I would say that most opponents of Netanyahu, who are also opponents of Gantz dividing the Blue and White and creating a unity alignment, don't believe that the government will last its full 3-year term. Now, there are several clauses within the agreement that say that if Netanyahu would try to collapse the government prior to handing over the premiership to Gantz, then Gantz immediately becomes the prime minister, and elections would not be able to be held for 6 months. So if in 12 months' time, Netanyahu sees the clock is ticking and thinks that he has the potential to go to elections and win, that such a move to call no confidence in the government would immediately make Gantz the prime minister for at least 6 months' time. Now, what's interesting is that I do not believe that those clauses are in place for what happens the day after Gantz becomes the prime minister. Let's say that in 18 months, in September of next year, Gantz becomes the prime minister. He's the prime minister now for 3 or 4 weeks, or 6 weeks, or 8 weeks. This government is mostly composed of the Likud, which is the largest party in the government, and also the religious allies of Netanyahu. So he definitely holds a key, a majority in this coalition. So if Gantz will become the prime minister, there's nothing really holding back anybody from putting forward a motion of no confidence at that time, which would also trigger an election. So the Israeli political system is set up in such a way that it is very, very easy for no confidence motions to be brought. In fact, they're brought on almost a daily basis, and very, very few Israeli governments actually serve out their full term. So just based on history, I think that we could all imagine that there's a strong likelihood that a government will not last 3 years. But like I said, this next 18-month period is a critical period potentially in the history of the state of Israel, much more so than the previous 18-month period. So thinking too far ahead right now is really not the order of the day. Rather to recognize that we've stabilized the system just enough to have the political quiet that we need to get through the coronavirus crisis, as well as the impending corruption trials that are going to start in the coming months.
So the drama can continue. Sarah Leah, more questions?
Yes, thank you. Our next question, do you think Gantz will ever serve as the Prime Minister?
I do think it's likely that Gantz will serve as the Prime Minister of Israel, because if Netanyahu seeks to cancel the government before the 18-month period, that's an automatic trigger for Gantz to become the Prime Minister. So the government is set up in such a way where Gantz is supposed to become the Prime Minister in 18 months, if not sooner, if anybody tries to cancel the agreement. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Gantz will be a long-serving Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and doesn't guarantee him 18 months in office.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, what would Netanyahu's legal status be as Vice Prime Minister if convicted while serving as Vice Prime Minister? Would he have to leave office?
So one of the agreements that was made, and this is again why the negotiations took many, many weeks, is that a law will be initiated to give a vice prime minister the same status as a prime minister with regard to serving under indictment. But Netanyahu would be barred from holding any ministry. When the government begins, Benny Gantz will be the vice prime minister, but also the defense minister. If Gantz becomes a prime minister in 18 months, Netanyahu will only be the vice prime minister, and there will be specific legislation that will be advanced in the coming weeks in order to permit Netanyahu to serve as the vice prime minister, even under an indictment with the same terms as a prime minister.
Okay, thank you. So this next question is similar to one that was asked before, but if you have anything new to touch on it, it'd be great. Can you foresee this emergence as any possible policy difference that could lead either Netanyahu or Gantz to force this new government to fall before its intended term ends? Essentially, how stable do you expect the government to be?
Netanyahu somehow was able to govern for the last year without a government. And not only to keep the country stable, but actually to perform admirably in that period. And again, right now we are in the midst of a health and economic crisis, the likes of which we don't even yet fully understand. So I do believe that at least during the period of the coronavirus crisis, and we don't know how long that period is going to last, that this government will remain intact because it came together specifically to deal with this crisis. So for at least the immediate time being, we like I said, Israelis cannot move more than 500 meters from their home, which means that we cannot see too far ahead into the future. But I do think that during this critical period in Israel's history, potentially that this government will stick together. I do believe that the government will stick together for at least the next 12 to 14 months, in the very least, no matter what. And considering the instability that we've had over the last year and a half, to buy a year of stability with this government is already a major accomplishment. And anything that we get beyond that is a bonus.
Okay, thank you. We'll have time for a few more questions. The next one we have, what did Gantz gain from this deal besides the ministry posts and the possibility of being prime minister in 18 months?
Well, there's a few things. Number one, as the main challenger to Netanyahu and the one who's been holding up the formation of any kind of a unity government, he has simply done the right thing. And if he's a man of integrity, especially recognizing that we're coming now into a massive crisis situation, putting the party politics aside, even with a bitter hatred for Netanyahu, to stabilize the system just long enough to deal with Corona is the right thing. And if Gantz is a man of integrity, then I really see no other option for him than to do what he just did. So he has said over and over again, I'm putting the nation before my own political career. So I believe that he did that. Two, recent polls show that if Israel went to a fourth election, then Netanyahu could possibly have achieved as many as 40 seats, 4 more seats than he currently had, and would easily have formed a right-wing government. Now, of course, the polls are nice to smell, but you shouldn't drink them. So we don't know. That's a famous Shimon Peres quote. But we don't know how polls will translate onto an election day, and we don't even know how an election could be carried out or when it could be carried out, for that matter, under the current situation. But Gantz was not a lock to win the next election. And in fact, if you just look at the results after the third election, Gantz lost the election. His party was 3 seats less than Netanyahu's party, and his bloc of center-left allies received almost 400 or more than 400,000 votes less than Netanyahu's bloc. So he did the right thing by joining into a government, and he was no lock to become the prime minister if Israel went to a fourth election. This may very well be his best chance and only chance of becoming prime minister.
Thank you. I believe this may be our last question. One of our viewers is wondering where Avigdor Lieberman ends up. Does he have any role in the new unity government?
No, Avigdor Lieberman is exactly where he belongs, finally, in the opposition. Lieberman has historically repeatedly crashed governments. He's resigned from ministerial posts more than any other member of the Knesset. He is the one who resigned from Netanyahu's stable 67-member government in November of 2018 that triggered the early election cycle. He is the one that held up the formation of a government on successive electoral, after successive elections and negotiations. He is potentially the worst instigator in Israeli politics today, perhaps also along with Yair Lapid. And fortunately, the two of them get to go into the opposition, where they will sit with the far-left Meretz party, with the larger joint list of Arab parties, and if Yamina decides not to enter the government, where they do belong from an ideological perspective, they too will sit in the opposition.
Wow. Was that the last question, Sarah?
Yes, that was all of our questions. Thank you.
Amazing. I mean, also Avigdor Lieberman is ideologically right-wing, and to be sitting together with Meretz and the Arab parties is probably a very appropriate punishment for his being the breaker of the government. He was originally the breaker who called for elections. So it's amazing. All right, we cannot thank you enough, Alex, for your insights, your wisdom, your perspective, and for your knowledge of every, down to the minute detail about every personality in the Knesset and what is going on in Israeli politics, and particularly with this coronavirus. It is always a real treat to be able to listen to you. And I do want to tell our viewers that Alex is the managing editor, the Jerusalem bureau chief of of JNS.org, which is a phenomenal publication. Despite the fact that I write for it, it is a phenomenal publication. All of the writing is original, and if people would like make a contribution to JNS.org, I know that they would really appreciate that. It is really, they have so much wonderful young talent, and that definitely disqualifies me because I'm the grandma of the group here. Young talent that writes for them, and it's an up-and-coming force to reckon with. So if people would like to contribute to JNS.org, they're certainly encouraged to do so. I also want to say that tomorrow morning, or tomorrow LA time, at 9 in the morning, 12 noon Eastern time, 7 p.m. Jerusalem time. We're going to be honored to have the United States Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism, Ilan Carr, addressing us. And the following week, as special for Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, we're going to have Yoram Ettinger, who has been my mentor in politics. And he's also a brilliant force to reckon with. He's going to be talking about the myth of the Palestinian time bomb, which has led many people in the left to feel that Israel has got to immediately withdraw from territories because it cannot maintain the territories which Israel needs strategically and still maintain itself as a democracy and a Jewish state. So he will be tackling that head on. So we are absolutely, again, honored to have Alex. Our work continues. We've been working very, very hard lately on a few initiatives, and coronavirus or not, we've had many conference calls with staffers and members of Congress throughout the day, working on different issues, including what's going on with the Lebanese armed forces and their very cozy relationship with Hezbollah on Israel's north, and trying to do something about that, and at least trying to withhold Americans' taxpayers' dollars to the LAF until such a time as we can determine that there is an absolute role that the money has initially been appropriated for, and that is to act as leverage against Hezbollah. And we're unfortunately seeing a tremendous amount of collusion with Hezbollah. So much so that Sarit Zahavi, who's going to be speaking with us in the first week of May, who is a lieutenant colonel in the IDF, feels that in the next war, LAF will actually participate together with Hezbollah. So please check out our website, www.emetonline.org. We also can use any contributions if anybody would like to at this very difficult and challenging time. And also please check out jns.org, which does wonderful work. Thank you so much. Please, as someone has just flashed on the screen, yes, our website is www.emetonline.org, and look at jns.org as well. Thank you so much, and bravo, Alex Traiman.
Thank you.